I've been so black and blue. Even the mouse ran from my house. They laugh at you and scorn you too. What did I do, baby, to be so black and blue? I'm white.
Around the turn of the 19th century, a new and exciting genre of music was brewing in New Orleans. Fueled by oppression, it was an outlet for profound emotional expression unlike any other type of music. A formation of styles only possible in the cultural melting pot of the United States, jazz would develop throughout the 20th century to become one of America's greatest gifts to the world. Jazz, though a uniquely American art form made possible by the amalgamation of various cultures and races, had and continues to have a special significance to African Americans, who provided an irreplaceable contribution to the development of jazz. Despite the pervasiveness of racial discrimination throughout its evolution, jazz ultimately did help Americans break racial boundaries. Jazz's foundation and early development in the late 19th century and early 20th century New Orleans drew on all sorts of cultural musical trends. African music had been carried over by the slave trade, and several African musical practices then lent themselves to early jazz. Both traditional African music and slave work songs incorporated the call and response technique, which became common in jazz. African music includes polyrhythms, which slaves simplified into cross rhythms, and syncopated rhythms in their original songs. Jazz later adopted this unorthodox rhythmic style. As the primary founders of jazz, African Americans' influence was profound. Essential to the later development of jazz, ragtime was developed by blacks and drew upon everything from European folk melodies, African syncopated rhythms, military marches, and slave spirituals. One musical movement that would become a foundation of jazz was the blues. The blues came to New Orleans with many blacks that wished to avoid oppression elsewhere in the South. Emotional and expressive, the ability for variation on top of it was crucial to jazz later on. Storyville, the predominantly black red light district of New Orleans, was the center for the early jazz practiced by greats, most notably black trumpeter Buddy Bolden. Though its roots are firmly entrenched in New Orleans, jazz didn't remain there forever. After 1917, a large migration of Southern blacks caused over 1.5 million to move north by the late 1920s. Seeking economic and social improvements, many went to Chicago, bringing early jazz music with them. Whites also provided surprising contributions to the early jazz scene. Following the Civil War, Union and Confederate soldiers' old wind instruments were left behind in New Orleans stores. Thanks to them, blacks were able to purchase instruments very cheaply and teach themselves. Whites were the first to record jazz music. The original Dixieland Jazz Band was a white group from New Orleans. Recorded in 1917, many black musicians were angry that a white group that wasn't as talented as some black groups was popularizing music that meant so much to blacks. Nevertheless, it managed to get jazz national attention. European styles did manage to influence jazz as well. While jazz emerged as a creation of African Americans, it adopted a vital non-African aspect of music, harmony, a musical trait far more common in European music than African music. Without this, jazz wouldn't have appealed to audiences nearly as much. Sampling famous, often European melodies was common in jazz solos. Louis Armstrong's solo in this live performance clearly incorporates a line of a famous melody. Even black jazz artists pulled inspiration from European music. Racial inequality was a part of jazz from its beginning, both positively and negatively. Segregation, made constitutional by Plessy versus Ferguson, divided blacks and Creoles against whites. Creoles, previously able to pursue music, were grouped with blacks and forced to play with and teach untrained black ensembles. For whites, minstrel shows perpetuated the idea of blacks being over-the-top entertainers, even after minstrel shows declined in popularity. Many popular jazz musicians were pressured to put on a show for audiences beyond playing music. Louis Armstrong was one such person with his performance in the movie A Rhapsody in Black and Blue. He is dressed in a leopard skin, surrounded by bubbles. This outlandish scenario is a result of minstrelsy, as blacks were expected to be entertainers as well as musicians. From the 1920s to the 1950s, jazz finally grew massively popular around the country during the swing era. African Americans continued to maintain a great deal of control over the jazz movement. The banjo was a part of the jazz scene until it was overtaken by the guitar in the 1930s. It was created by blacks in the image of African instruments, tying back to their roots. African Americans highly valued female sensuality, emoting that through jazz, and the two almost went hand in hand. Whites viewed this as immorality and indecency, and often rejected jazz due to that. Big band jazz, the use of a large ensemble, was hugely popularized in this era. It was first done by Fletcher Henderson, a black man from Georgia in New York City in 1919, and was widely adopted decades later. This integration had a massive impact. Future Brown versus Board of Education lawyer Charles Black spoke about seeing Louis Armstrong play as a child. It is impossible to overstate the significance of a 16-year-old Southern boy seeing genius for the first time in a black. We literally never saw a black then in any but a servant's capacity. Jazz helped whites see the humanity of blacks that society never let them see. The popularity of the radio helped spread jazz and break down discrimination. White listeners couldn't tell if a band was white or black on the radio, forcing many to appreciate the talent of black musicians. Big band leaders were a large part of the breaking down of boundaries in jazz. During this era, many band leaders like Benny Goodman began to integrate their ensembles. They daringly forced change despite dissent. White band leaders pushed for equal treatment of their black musicians. Norman Granz insisted that all of his band's performances be open to blacks. Believing that his black musicians were just as talented as their white bandmates, he went out of his way to reduce discrimination. Despite this, discrimination and equality were still factors that affected jazz. Billie Holiday's haunting song Strange Fruit became an iconic protest to the lynching and mistreatment of blacks. Louis Armstrong's song What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue expresses the struggles that come with being a black American.
I'm white inside, but that don't help my case. 'Cause I can't hide what is in my burden, what.
Latin contributions to jazz were unique and vital in forming the Latin jazz subgenre. Islands such as Cuba were a major destination during the slave trade, so many Africans were shipped there. Their musical traditions combined with Spanish ones, creating the Cuban rumba. Many slaves had been shipped to America from the West Indies, bringing Caribbean music styles with them. These trends would influence the music of later generations. Jazz underwent a great deal of change from the 1950s to the modern day, continuing to be surrounded by racial discrimination. Jazz during the 1950s and 60s, particularly during the Civil Rights Movement, became even more a medium of expression in reaction to inequality. Racist acts of violence involved even the most celebrated jazz musicians, such as pianist Nat King Cole. He was attacked on stage by a group of white racists, but managed to survive. No amount of commercial success protected blacks. Some jazz artists made songs that became a part of the Civil Rights Movement, including I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free by Nina Simone. This song, among others, became symbols of the struggle. According to some, jazz predicted the Civil Rights Movement. The views expressed and steady broaching of boundaries in jazz over the years led up to the outburst against racism. Dr. King himself spoke about the special importance that jazz had to blacks, as well as its impact on the Civil Rights Movement. After the Civil Rights Movement ended, intolerance remained. Miles Davis was one of many who was beat up and wrongfully arrested by the police. Despite their international success, renowned musicians such as Davis were not immune to everyday racism. To escape American discrimination, many black jazz musicians moved abroad in the 1960s and 70s. It speaks volumes about the intensity of racism that jazz artists would leave jazz's birthplace. Some, like Miles Davis, still believed that jazz was segregated in the sense that blacks are naturally better at it. This opinion, especially when held by a jazz great, encouraged partitions. Around the turn of the 20th century and beyond, jazz has spread around the globe while keeping its roots and its heart in the African American population. On the 50th anniversary of Miles Davis's greatest album, Kind of Blue, the House passed a bill that redeclared jazz as being a national treasure. This acknowledges the pivotal role that blacks played in jazz, as well as the significance and history of an art form produced by blacks. Though blacks now have much more equality, some still use jazz to express their feelings about issues like police violence and racial profiling. For them, jazz remains a medium of racial communication. Though race has expanded jazz and held it back, it was fundamental in its formation. The jazz known today, be it swing, bebop, Latin, or another style, would not exist had all races not shared their musical traditions and lived through discrimination. Jazz spoke the true feelings of blacks, their sorrow, their fear, their passion. For For that, it speaks volumes about America's history as a multicultural nation in the past century.